What's up, y'all? I'll be starting a new podcast series called The Outsider, where I divert my attention from Asian people to focus more generally on any race of people that I believe have a compelling, intriguing, and unique voice that might broaden your view. On this episode of The Outsider, I will be interviewing and talking with Ken Illgunas, a man who trekked 10,000 miles across North America, having intermittent journeys summing up to 1,000 miles through Ontario in a canoe, and hitchhiked and walked 1,700 miles across the Great Plains, following the proposed route of the Keystone XL pipeline. Most people would say that he has a mind of steel, and that his perseverance to protest against the building of the Keystone XL pipeline was otherworldly. The ruptured blisters he stepped on continuously, the aching shin splints he pushed through, and the loneliness he encountered daily. Surely this would seem like a story of pain, right? He did so many different things. He was so unique in the way he protested. Isn't he just so much different than everyone? Right? Well, the reason I interviewed Ken is not only for his amazing journey in North America, but also the ironic journey he has gone through that no one knows too much about. The beginning of his life was boring. He was plain. His everyday actions were mundane. Everything about him screamed, I am just a normal high schooler. He had a girlfriend. He was doing alright in his classes, and he cared about college as much as any other high schooler. I'll get into more specifics later, but as you can tell and as you will be able to tell, his story is like a rose blooming from ashes. Without a doubt, his accomplishments are quite mind-boggling. He is a journalist, a protester, a hiker, literally almost anything. In fact, we could talk about his achievements on and on, but you can find that anywhere online. Actually, I strongly encourage you to go out and seek what he has done. However, unlike many other podcasts, not only do I talk about achievements and great works, I talk about the upcomings of the people who created them. Here is the story and the podcast episode. I hope you enjoy. So the first question I have is, this one is more of like a precursor. I would like to know more about your life. So if you mind telling me, what was your childhood like?
It was a very good childhood. I grew up in a safe environment um, with two loving parents, a younger brother. Um, I guess my first memories are in a small city in Canada called Hamilton. It's a steel city. My father worked in the steel industry for the first part of his career as just a steel worker, and yeah, we had just like a nice suburban upbringing, and then my mom wanted us to move where she came from, which is North Tonawanda, New York. So we lived right next to that, a little town called Wheatfield, which used to be very agricultural, but as we were moving in, it was rapidly turning into, suburb land, suburbia. So we lived in a nice suburban neighborhood called Country Meadows, and a lot of it was spent outdoors. Um, my brother and I, we played a ton of street hockey and tackle football. For whatever reason, this neighborhood was dominated by boys. There was almost no girls in it. It was like 90% boys. So there was always people to play with. But I don't want it to make it sound like it's too kind of like Huck Finn. Like I grew up playing video games and watched a lot of TV too. So I started with Nintendo and went up to Sega and then Nintendo 64 and PlayStation 2. So I guess it was just a nice, it was a terrific childhood. Um, we didn't have a big family. My father's from Scotland, and all of our ancestors are were over in Scotland, and my mom didn't have a big family, so we were just kind of on our own. Uh, that's kind of taking an uncritical look at that childhood. There was things that the childhood was kind of missing. Suburbs that by their very nature, they're not very tightly knit communities. You're kind of on your own in some ways. And I did have a lack of nature in my life. I never really went on just a nature hike until I was 21 years old. So there was things my life was missing then. But I think what matters most for a kid is, um, a safe, loving environment. And I certainly had that.
Yeah. I would definitely like to extend more on the thing that you were talking about where you said like a lot of the land was taken like over by suburbs or like there's more buildings that were taking over the nature. But I think we can leave that question for later. I would like to talk about high school and college for you. I know you said that you weren't really totally a good student and that you were like a English major, but could you expand more on what high school and college meant for you and what were your goals during that time?
Yeah, I didn't have any any goals at all in high school. Maybe an unarticulated goal was just simply to get through it and to get through it without embarrassing myself. I wasn't without pride. I'd be embarrassed if I failed a test or something like that. And of course, I enjoyed getting a 100 score on something, but generally I didn't mind. Like a lot of my fellow students, my girlfriend, for instance, was hyper competitive in high school. She was very motivated and very smart. And I wasn't, maybe for a couple reasons. Maybe it was just because I knew I didn't have the natural intelligence that a lot of the brightest kids had. And things don't come as easy for you as it may for them. Two, there may have been kind of like a cultural thing too. Like you see a lot of young men, older boys. Um, it's almost kind of uncool to be interested in school and learning. So you kind of put on this kind of slouchy, I don't care sort of pose, and that just kind of becomes you. And I think um, that's what happened. And I think I was kind of just a little bit disgusted by the kind of the hyper competitiveness too. Like everyone trying to get the highest GPA and get into the top 10% and to get into the top 10. I think I rightfully kind of rolled my eyes at that. It was just kind of accomplishment for the sake of accomplishment. I don't think there was actually any love of learning behind their quest to be on top. So I mean, I wish I did try harder and I wish I did get better grades because that may have made things easier for me later on with regard to getting like a financial aid scholarship. But at the same time, I lived a good life then and I had good friends and we played a lot of sports together. I loved watching movies. I enjoyed playing video games. When I had a girlfriend for my last couple of years, I loved spending time with her. So it's just like I was more focused on doing the things that brought me joy. So yeah, I look back a little bit critically on my younger self because I could have done better and used that time a little bit better. But at the same time, um, there was a little bit of wisdom to my slacking off, if I could put it that way.
Could you talk more about, like looking back in the past? Like when you do it, when you look back into what you did before, do you see regret in anything, or do you just see the past as just something that's happened and you just have to move on?
Sometimes when I look at really bright people, I get a little jealous. Um, super articulate people, people with musical talents and languages, and just that kind of refinement of civilization that a lot of people have. Sometimes I wish I'd spent my high school years while my brain was still developing and more supple than it is now, learning a musical instrument or a second language, because I'm trying to do those things now, and it's not easy. It comes to me very, very slowly. It's very hard. And I just think about all of the video games I played, like the hours and hours and hours. It's just like, man, that time could have been used a bit more productively. So if there's a regret, there's that. But there's always another side to the coin. You do see those kids who didn't live a well-balanced life. You do see those kids who threw their whole selves into this hyper competitive atmosphere to compete with their students, to get into the best school possible, and join as many clubs as possible, and take on as many duties as possible, and work on their homework for hours and hours and hours. You see them suffer pretty severe mental health problems. I've been around elite academic institutions. I've visited places like Harvard. I went to school at Duke. And yeah, they're bright and accomplished kids, but I'd also say that, and this is just from observation, it's not looking at any sort of data, but I'd say they're disproportionately suffering from mental health problems for these very reasons, for being pushed too hard, either by themselves or social parental expectations, or just living an unbalanced life. So I always need to remind myself that even though I do have a few regrets about not making the most of my time in my secondary education, I was always a more or less contented person who had a good enough mental health. So I just need to kind of take the full view of everything.
I could definitely relate to the hours of video games. I remember during middle school, 6th grade, 7th grade, 8th grade, I would come home every day after school and just hop on games with my friends and play hours and hours. And when I look back on it, I do feel some kind of guilt. Like I could have spent it. I see everybody around me just having all these skills in front of them. But then, like what you said, I do feel content. At least I was able to live, or I had a good social life, or I could make friends a lot easier during middle school because I was able to hang out with them through video games.
And that's not to say all video games or all movies or all TV shows are bad for you.
Definitely.
Yeah, I mean, it's some of them can be wonderful exercise for the mind, and when you're not living in like a worldly culture, like I grew up in a house, we don't have any bookshelves. We have one book on the mantelpiece, and it's a fake book. You go pick it up; it's not even a real book. It says Leo Tolstoy War and Peace on it, but there's no pages in it. So having generous access to good TV, having generous access to good movies, that's its own sort of worldliness. It's its own access to worldliness. And frankly, if I didn't have access to my local video factory and Blockbuster, which used to be stores where we'd go and rent movies, I feel like I wouldn't have the same desire to be a worldly citizen now. I think that was one of the keys to kind of I don't, broadening me in some way.
I would like to go towards the walk that you did on the Keystone
Mhm.
Pipeline. So my first question for that is, what were your values before, during, and after the trip, and how did they change through what you've seen and what you saw?
I mean, values are something that are such a fundamental part of your character that it goes pretty. You could even argue that it goes deep into your early childhood. So I don't know if I'm prepared to say that my values significantly evolved as a result of this 1,700-mile walk I went on. So maybe it's not values that change, but certainly kind of um, perspective evolves, an outlook on life evolves. And I have to, remind you that I went on this trip when I was 28. I think our most formative years are, our late teens and early 20s when we're really just emerging into adulthood. And I think that's the places we go and the people we meet. They, more than other places, as in other times and other people, they imprint themselves on us at that time more than in later at life. So I think I had all the same values, but it taught me a few things. Like, one, it taught me that the Great Plains of North America is one of the most beautiful and underappreciated landscapes on Earth. It reminded me of how kind and generous people are, how kind and generous Americans are. It's so easy to be cynical today, and there's so many good reasons to be cynical and pessimistic and misanthropic and kind of even anti-American, um, because the world we see on the news, in our newspapers, on social media, that's an America that does not look appealing at all. It makes us seem very, very divided. But when you walk across America, and almost every day you're being offered some comfort or favor from a complete stranger, and strangers who very well could have extremely different ideological and political viewpoints than myself. When you're taken care of almost every day by strangers on a walk across the country, that cynicism, it just vanishes like a cloud after a storm, and you begin to feel like this is a wonderful home, a wonderful country we live in. I'd also say it just kind of broadened how I look at ordinary folks, oftentimes working in extractive, sometimes environmentally damaging industries, whether that's farming or ranching or pipeline laying or oil extraction. It's easy to kind of have a judgmental viewpoint on people who participate in industries that do kind of net damage to the world. But when you see how complicated things are, I mean, when you're trying to run a farm and you're barely getting by, like, the concept of going organic is almost impossible to imagine. Just to survive, you need to increase your yield. Or people working up in the oil industry, often living miserable lives away from their families for weeks on end in a place where you're liable to get addicted to alcohol and drugs. And when you're working super long hours and there's just no kind of spirituality in your life, I mean, our 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 blame and our judgment and our ire should not be directed at them, even if they're participating in industries that do a lot of damage. I think we need to point that ire to other places. So I'd say my 4.5 month long walk has enlightened me on these subjects, but it hasn't touched my values. My values are were and always will be the same, and that's that I think that we should live in a world and strive to make a world that that tries to make everybody's life better as well as that of Mother Nature.
Okay, for my next question, this one is during your walk. So you can obviously tell me if this is a totally wrong, but during the walk, did you ever feel like you weren't doing anything? Like maybe what you were doing walking this pipeline was just like worthless, like it wasn't doing anything. Did you ever have those thoughts?
Probably, probably, yeah. Um, yeah, for sure. I don't think it was like a too much of a depressing thought. I mean, early on, uh, you know, I think I thought that maybe this hike would have value if the public took notice, and maybe it affected change in some way. Maybe it would make this pipeline a little bit more difficult to put in the ground. Maybe it would create some more awareness and more conversation around our usage of fossil fuels. So that was kind of my hope. And early on, as I'm just kind of pecking away at my keyboard in my tent and throwing up a few blog entries, it's pretty easy and pretty accurate to say I was having practically no effect on anything. But did I feel in any way discouraged by that? No, because there was multiple purposes to my hike. It wasn't just about, starting some movement or affecting change. That would be great if it did those things. But at the end of the day, I was still on a journey. I was still testing myself physically, testing myself mentally. I was having an adventure. I had no idea every day who I'd meet, what I'd see, what animals would chase after me. Would I get in a bar fight in Montana tonight? Will I fall in love with some South Dakota woman tomorrow? It's just so exciting being on an adventure because you have no idea what the day will hold. So, yeah, I'm sure at times I felt like this is making no difference in the world. But did I ever feel like it was a waste of time? No, because there was always multiple purposes to it, multiple motivations.
Yeah, and you also did kind of answer my next question was like, how did you deal with knowing about it? For my next question, I'm wondering, first of all, I'd like to ask quickly, and you can quickly answer so I can see if the next question would make sense or not. But do you, as like an introvert that you kind of talked about before during the day, do you ever feel that being lonely can sometimes affect how you feel about what you're doing, such as going on this walk? Like, did you ever feel like isolated, that you were the only person who was doing this, that maybe, like what we said before, it was kind of not going to work, it was not going to affect the public if you couldn't make it out there?
I mean, that was actually pretty exciting to me, to be walking a route that no one had ever walked before. And I can say that with some confidence. Has anybody walked from Hardisty, Alberta to the Gulf Coast of Texas, either, in the 2010s or in the past, 20,000 years, ever since North America has been inhabited? No one has walked that exact route. So that was exciting to me to be doing that. And like living in a van on campus when I went to Duke University and lived in my van. That was back in 2009. This was well before #life, and kind of living in your van became like a cool thing to do. And I'm happy it's become a cool thing to do. But when I did it, it was just like a thing either really poor or creepy people did. So I felt like a pioneer in some way. I felt like I was kind of at the vanguard culturally. I felt like I was doing something that ought to have been done before, but the hell with it. I'm gonna do it. So that was really exciting, and things like the Appalachian Trail. And I respect anybody who hikes those big trails. I've hiked portions of it, and I know how amazing and challenging they are. And on a hike like that, I would see I'd see thousands of hikers, of course. I wouldn't feel as alone, but they have features that my Keystone XL trip did not. For instance, the Appalachian Trail has been blazed by someone else or a group of someone else, so a group of other people. So every step on that hike has kind of been determined by other people. Every footstep is going either north on the trail or south on the trail, and there's going to be signs as to where you get your water and where you sleep and blah blah blah. But so there was just, I can see how that would be very adventurous for someone who hasn't done a lot of hiking, and they should do something like that. But for me, who up in Alaska and worked in parks like the Gates of the Arctic Park, where it was my job to walk over wild land, mountain passes, and along river valleys and across miserable tussock-ridden tundra, it didn't excite me as much as the Keystone XL did. The Keystone XL would be more like that. It would be more about walking over open country with a compass and a map, and it would be, it just wasn't done before.
It's, you know, hard for me to, like imagine it, because I've only witnessed that kind of stuff online. The movie Into the Wild, where he just travels, keeps everything in a journal, and then finds his van, and his life is just portrayed in this movie with just inserts of people who knew what he did, telling the cinematographer, the director, what happened. And it's kind of like, I don't want to say that your thing is like a movie, because obviously I feel pretty influenced by the way that you traveled so much and you were able to meet so many people that it was kind of like a movie. But in a way, it's very interesting for me to talk to you in person. It's kind of like I'm talking to, say, if I watch Into the Wild, it's kind of like I'm talking to the person who's traveled, done so many things that I have not done or haven't even thought about doing. And it's just a very unique experience. And I thank you for just even coming here to talk with me about it.
I feel flattered by the question, or the comment, and I'm not sure exactly how to respond to it. I think maybe I'd feel something similar if I met an author who wrote a bunch of works that I was impressed by, and I just kind of thought, like, how did you do that all with this lifetime that you had? And I don't know. I'm really happy. I've done the things I've done, but in some way, it's just kind of all in the past, and I don't kind of live with those memories on a day-to-day basis. But I suppose they do a few things. I suppose they kind of settle into your subconscious, settle into your bones some way. So you're always in some way a mass of your experiences. And I also think living your 20s in say in an adventurous way, it's kind of laying a good foundation for the rest of your life, because I think as I head into my 40s, I'm not so plagued with regrets, with shoulda, couldas. I lived according to my natural human instincts for my 20s. So I don't see myself suffering from, say, a midlife crisis where I need to kind of find a way to reclaim the youth I never got to live. So I think it's important for us all to kind of, as close as we can, to live in accord with our natural human instincts, and that's certainly varies considerably from person to person. However, I'd say we do in our 20s generally have a questing instinct. We have an instinct to, you know, break away from the comforts of our old home, to make a splash, to make our mark in the world, to travel, to fall in love, to see lots of places, to have lots of experiences. And I think it's very damaging to the human spirit and soul if you don't listen to those inner voices, to that core self that sometimes calls you to go on an adventure. I think part of living a healthy present is having lived a healthy past. Yeah.
It's like it's just so crazy that, you know, it's weird for me because when I first saw you step onto that stage, you in my eyes were like a famous, very famous person, because you traveled this huge distance that nobody I know has ever done, and you've met so many people, you wrote so much, and it was kind of like you were a superstar on that stage. But here I am talking with you, and we're talking about, you know, topics that I don't think would necessarily I would define as like an interview, but it gets me thinking, you know, like it's I don't have a hard time describing this, but it just feels like despite being so different, and for you being so like out of my knowledge of the world, like out of my scope of what I'm seeing, you are, this might sound kind of weird, but like you are just as human as anyone else, and you have experienced just as much as everybody else. I don't know if that makes any sense.
Well, and maybe this isn't speaking to the core of your point, but I feel like an average, extremely average person. Like I think there's been a few motivations to live the life I have. Some of them is just kind of instinctual. Like my first instinct to go up to Alaska, as you know, I started thinking about this when I was 16, 17. It was just like weird, and I was obsessive about it, and it was as if I was being drawn to the wild by gravity. There's that. But sometimes when I'd sit around a circle of folks and they start telling stories and talking, I would just have nothing to say. I would just feel so uninteresting. I just feel like I had no stories in my life. And like I said, like my high school self was into video games and sports and having a few beers with my friends and hanging out with my girlfriend. Like these are really average, ordinary things. So I think I knew, I identified the fact that I'm a really boring person. Like, and I could go on the rest of my life doing these ordinary things and be minimally content, watching the Buffalo Bills and eating a whole pizza and playing some Civilization 5 and maybe forcing myself to go to some 9 to 5 job that I could tolerate. Like that could have been me. And honestly, in 10 parallel universes, that is me. So I think I I purposefully tried to say goodbye to that person or transform myself by doing adventurous things, by going up to Alaska, by hitchhiking from Alaska to New York, by hitchhiking from Mississippi up to New York, by going on a canoe trip in Ontario, Canada, dressed like the voyageurs. I basically lived as if I was in the 18th century for a summer in Canada. You could say I did these things to kind of fast forward my development. You could say I did them so I could be a more interesting person, a more individuated person, someone with stories, someone who might be like attractive to the opposite sex, someone who's just not so boring. So it's kind of been like a half conscious, half unconscious decision to do these things to, I don't want to say reinvent myself, but upgrade myself to something else.
Now, I really enjoyed this talk with Ken. It opened something in me. I'm thinking about something that's different. I'm thinking that almost anyone, even if they're mundane or, plain, if they put their mind to it, they can become anything they want. And I know there are some obstacles that prevent some people from becoming who they want to be, but I think this story is very inspiring and also shows you that you don't have to have everything in order, everything perfect to achieve your goal. I really hope you guys enjoy this podcast episode and you tune in for my next podcast episodes. See you later.